A global call for action on climate change. Hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets of the world's major cities as a UN climate summit gets underway in New York. But can these protesters influence their leaders and change the way companies operate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's an issue that appears to unite people around the world like no other, but one that political leaders seem perilously incapable of dealing with: climate change and the potentially catastrophic consequences of doing nothing. And now hundreds of thousands of people in more than 150 countries have taken to the streets to demand action, a show of force ahead of the UN's climate summit on Tuesday. Before we start our discussion, Kristen Salumi reports from New York on what's been described as the largest climate change march in history.
This is more than a march for climate action. Organizers say it is a movement, and it's being led by those on the front lines of climate change. From coastal communities who are losing their neighborhoods to rising sea levels and extreme weather, to indigenous groups who traveled from the southwest of the United States.
The delegation that we brought, we're being impacted by fossil fuel development for over 40 years. So we have a big boom of fracking going on our reservation, history of uranium mining, and the area where I work is coal country. So, we've felt the negative impacts of all of these for years, and we're here to join with our brothers and sisters to push for a just transition outside of the fossil fuel economy.
Plenty of dignitaries on hand, including former U.S. Vice President and climate activist Al Gore, and United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Ban has convened an international climate summit here in New York on Tuesday. There are efforts underway to reach a binding international agreement by next year.
Nothing's going to happen this week in New York at the UN. The big action is out here on the streets, and this is finally the climate change movement coming of age, demonstrating that it is a profound concern for people. This is the biggest political gathering about anything in the United States in many years, okay? And that's the message above all that we need to get across.
Environmental activists have been down this road before. What's different this time is the broad coalition that's supporting them, from faith-based groups to labor unions. They're hoping to create a groundswell of public support for action.
Major unions brought thousands of people, reflecting labor's evolving position on how climate action will impact jobs and the economy.
It's not going to hurt the economy. It's the only choice we have. If we don't combat climate change, then our economy will ultimately be devastated.
With strength in numbers, activists are calling for an agreement that will keep the rise in temperature to under 2 degrees Celsius by completely phasing out carbon pollution and switching to 100% clean energy by the year 2050. They say we must act now or pay the price later.
The people, united, will never be defeated.
Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
Well, some 125 world leaders will attend Tuesday's UN summit on climate change. It's being convened by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to help galvanize action and outline a plan for a meeting to be held in Paris next year, where it's hoped world leaders will sign a new international treaty on climate. You might remember the last time leaders met to negotiate on climate change was in Copenhagen in 2009, and they failed to produce an agreement at the time. Well, let's bring in our guests. In New York, Michael Jacobs, Senior Advisor to the New Climate Economy. He's also Director of Strategy for the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. And in Geneva, Lassman-Trappier, an environmental campaigner. Welcome to both of you. To begin with, Michael Jacobs, it's taken decades, it appears, but the weekend's events would appear to indicate that climate change as an issue is now being taken up at grassroots level. Would you say that's accurate?
I think what you've seen this weekend is the manifestation of that. I think there's actually been quite a lot of activism at grassroots level for a long time. And what's different now, actually, is that the political leaders are re-engaging with the subject. And what this demonstration over the weekend was designed to do, all around the world, in all the cities it took place, was to remind the leaders that there are many, many people who care deeply about this, who are themselves affected by climate change, particularly in developing countries and in poorer communities, and they want the leaders to do something about it. So the change is actually that it's back on the leaders' agenda, and it's really important that there is this summit in New York on Tuesday, organised by Ban Ki-moon, the UN General Secretary General, in which leaders will be, for the first time since 2009, forced to engage with the subject of climate change, something many of them would rather not. And that's really important because it sets us then on track to achieving this new international agreement on climate next year in Paris. And that's the crucial moment at which we really need as a global community to address this issue.
Well, and Lassman-Trappier, some argue that politicians, world leaders, don't listen until people actually shout in their ears. Has that been your experience as a grassroots activist?
Yes, exactly. Yes, for the past 20 years, in fact, we've had to keep organizing things to put our issues in the forefront of things, but we haven't been listened to very much. And it's when we keep doing it and eventually that we can't be not noticed that politicians notice and maybe change their policies.
Michael Jacobs, we've seen this, as we are saying, these worldwide demonstrations. There appears to be almost a linkage to what we saw with protests about globalization, a grassroots reaction to something that has not been in the hands of the people in the streets to this point. Would you agree with that parallel?
Yes, I think that is true. I think many people around the world don't feel that leaders have listened to them about many issues, particularly around the way in which the global economy develops, and climate change is one of those, and in many ways it's the biggest and most dangerous because it will affect everybody on the planet. What I think is interesting is that this isn't only a grassroots movement. If you look at the business community today around the world, most of the major businesses are saying to governments themselves, this is a crucial issue for the future of the economy, for the future of jobs, for the future of our businesses. This isn't just something which a few activists care about. If you don't deal with this issue, you will risk the very nature of the economy that creates wealth and so on. So, for example, last week, the report that I've been involved with from this Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, a group of former leaders and finance ministers, leading business people, leading finance people, came out with a report last week which said we can achieve economic growth at the same time as we address climate risk. So we don't have to choose between a successful economy and tackling climate change. That was always the problem, I think, that many politicians have felt in the past. They felt that if they were going to act on climate change, this would in some way hurt the economy. And this commission has made it absolutely clear in a huge report full of evidence that you can get strong economic performance at the same time as reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. And that, I think, changes the story that politicians have to tell their publics. It isn't one of sacrifice. We don't have to sacrifice jobs or prosperity or the economy in order to deal with climate change. We can have a strong economy and deal with climate change if we do it in the right way. And this report has now given leaders the ammunition to take that argument to one another and back to their publics. And I think this does mark a really important change in the nature of the debate about climate change and how we act on it.
Well, and Lassman-Trappier, this is an important point that Michael is making there about the mounting degree, perhaps, of self-interest that business leaders are defining here, that, as was pointed out there, climate change, fighting climate change, may not be detrimental to the economy. Have you seen this argument growing within the corporations, within the business leaders that you've been fighting against for so long?
Well, it's definitely an issue that is true and it's growing. I don't know if it's growing within the business world, but it is a fact that economies and local economies can thrive on a greener energy and greener transport in particular. And implementing the changes means we can actually get some growth that we're chasing, but better growth and quality jobs and local jobs with less emissions and less pollution. So I think everybody can win. So I hope that people and businesses can see that we can actually all win by making efforts to change the way we produce goods, sell goods, transport goods and so on, and live our lives. The life we lead at the moment, our way of life, is not sustainable on many, many different levels. It's already killing us today. Air pollution alone is killing 3.7 million people every year in the world. Climate change is going to be, we don't even know what it's going to be, but it could be horrendous for humanity. So we need to make changes and make them fairly quickly, because I think we waited far too long, and we're with our back to the wall now. We have to act.
Well, it may be instructive at this point to look at the particular rather than the general, to look at the tree rather than the forest, if one might say that. And Lassman-Trappier, you mentioned the issue of clean air. Well, you were closely involved with a struggle to create a cleaner air environment in an alpine situation, the area of Chamonix. This is something which would appear to suit everybody, the tourist operators, the people who live there, the people who make vast amounts of money of people moving into that tourist region. Yet it took years of struggle and eventually needed the imprint of the French government to actually do something that it would appear to be absolutely natural to have got done in the first place. It's a hard struggle, is it not?
Yes, it's been a hard struggle, and it took many years of doing many things, all sorts of different actions, to get the French government to notice that there were many benefits to doing something to improve the way we transport goods through the Alps, and to do something cleaner for everybody. It seems logical and obvious, but the lobbies are so powerful that it took us 20 years to get to this point. We managed this year, eventually, to get a first step. It's a very small step for the improvement of air quality and of emissions. But it's a very big step historically, because for the first time in France, the government is accepting that to protect public health, it can ban temporarily the circulation, the traffic of trucks through the Alps when there's a peak of pollution. So a small step, but a big victory for us. That's taken a long time to get to it.
Michael Jacobs, it is a campaign that has been taken up with a vast amount of small steps, week after week, month after month, year after year. Do you agree?
Yes, but we can't afford for every issue to take that long to resolve. Because we don't have that time with climate change. It'll be the next decade that determines whether we have a climate system that is safe for us to live under or whether we don't. Because it's the investments that will be made, particularly in developing countries over the next 10 to 15 years, in the way new cities are built, because vast numbers are coming to live in cities around the world, in the way in which energy systems are created. Energy plants last for 30 or 40 years. So what you build now will affect the emissions that we will have for the next 30 or 40 years. So it's this next period which will determine whether or not we have climate change that is more or less unlivable for human beings and for the rest of the planet, or whether we can control it to an extent which allows us to continue to have prosperous lives and to develop in poorer countries. So the big decisions need to be made now, and we really cannot wait for 20 years' worth of campaigning, which means that the leaders of governments, the ones who are meeting in New York tomorrow, really need to be listening to the grassroots campaigners that you've been seeing on your clip there and Anne's been talking about. And luckily, I think we do have a sense that this is beginning to happen. Anne mentioned these terrible problems of air pollution. If you look to in developing countries, air pollution is a real killer now, as Anne mentioned. 3.7 million people dying from outdoor pollution alone, almost all of that associated with fossil fuels. And yet you also see, at the same time as people are protesting about this, action being taken. If you look at China, China is now seriously trying to get to grips with its air pollution problem, and that at the same time it means that it's on a trajectory to reduce its emissions, its greenhouse gas emissions over time, because they come from the same fossil fuels. So action is being taken, and we can't counterpose now grassroots activism as against leaders acting. We need both. You need the grassroots to make sure that the leaders do take action, and then you need the leaders to take the responsibility with which they're charged. And that's the crucial combination we need to see over the next few years.
And perhaps as well a lever in between. Let me just introduce this particular point. Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu has called for a campaign of boycott and disinvestment against companies that profit from the use of fossil fuels. Writing in The Guardian, Desmond Tutu says, "Reducing our carbon footprint is not just a technical scientific necessity, it has also emerged as the human rights challenge of our time." He goes on to say, The United Nations deserves kudos for its leadership on human rights issues, but on climate change it has run up against governments and leaders of industry who have until now put short-term economic and political goals ahead of collective long-term survival. And Lassman-Trappier, we heard there the comment that this is a human rights issue. This is in a way changing the game. This is in the way focusing in on what it really is. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Climate change and all the environmental issues at the base of it, at the core of it, it's a human issue. It would be governing for people would change everything. If our politicians didn't govern for the big influence, the big lobbies and so on, if they really truly led everything with the people at heart, we'd have very different policies and we'd have a very different world. So I think if we can shift to a more human-based economy and political world, things will be very different and need to be very different.
Well, Michael Jacobs, right at the beginning of this programme, it was stated and has been underlying all the way through that the real business is only going to be done next year in Paris, that this is the beginning of a long-term process which has to be underway. Now, the Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has called for what he calls bold moves from all parties. He's looking for bold moves to be announced by world leaders within the next few days. What kind of bold moves do you think could be forthcoming?
Well, we know that some of the businesses represented at the summit in New York will be bringing new commitments, for example, to end the deforestation that is associated with particular commodities, palm oil, for example. And that's a really important commitment that some businesses are willing to make in association with governments and with civil society, environmental organisations. We're hoping that some of the government leaders represented at this summit will bring new announcements. But as you say, the real action will be next year in Paris and then beyond, because we mustn't think that an international agreement is itself the end. An international agreement brings together the commitments made by governments and forces them to hold one another to account. But the real action is in each country. It is in the national policies that governments bring on energy, on the way cities are developed, on the way agriculture is developed. And the great thing is that, in a sense, contrary to what you just quoted from Desmond Tutu, we no longer have to choose between economic progress and economic prosperity and tackling climate change. And this really is the big new message of the last week with this report, the Better Growth, Better Climate report that came out last week from the New Climate Economy Project. We don't have to choose. So we're not asking leaders to make sacrifices. We're not asking publics to make sacrifices. We're saying if you take a low carbon growth path, you can get the jobs, the prosperity, the reductions in poverty that you want, and you can also cut your greenhouse gas emissions. And that means now that we have a different kind of politics, it seems to me, looking forward. We do need visionary leaders who are not simply in the hands of the lobbyists for big fossil fuels, for big oil and so on. That is crucial, as Anne says. But we can now offer a prospect of a strong economy with jobs, with prosperity, at the same time as we tackle climate change. And that's the message that I really hope our leaders are hearing and are expressing this week.
I think it's important as well to stress the urgency in all of this. I mean, figures indicate, for example, and Lassman-Trappier, that there has been a massive rise in global temperatures over the past 12 months. Indeed, that greenhouse gas levels, for example, were at an all-time high last year. This is a growing situation. This sense of urgency, do you think it is there yet, Lassman-Trappier?
Well, it needs to be, because I think we waited too long already, and we are back against a wall now. We have to act now, unless otherwise we don't know what's going to happen to the future of our climate and therefore our humanity and our planet. So we need to react. And I am convinced personally that this subject will come from the bottom up. It needs to be coming from people, and this is what's happening now. People are showing that they actually care about this issue, they're worried about this issue, and they want their leaders to do something about it. And maybe when the leaders feel that there's enough people behind this movement, they will be able to be strong enough and to fight the lobbies and say, this is maybe not something you agree with, but we're going to have to go down this route because we want to save the climate. And I think energy and transport are two key sectors that have to be addressed. Sometimes people just go for very little measures around the real issues, but if we don't address those key issues, we're not really addressing climate change.
And yet the elephant in this particular room would appear to be political developments. Michael Jacobs, there is a political component to all of this. There are midterms coming, elections coming in the US at the beginning of November. Now, a recent poll there indicated that 68% of Democrats see climate warming as a threat, but only 25% of Republicans. Now, this is a partisan divide which may be unfair to single out the US. It has happened in other countries as well, where more conservative sectors do not see it as a threat, other sectors do. Is this an issue, the division among political movements that manifests itself as political power?
It's definitely an issue in the United States. Luckily, it's not so much an issue in most parts of the world. Whereas in the United States, climate change has become very ideological, and as you say, Republicans and Democrats are divided on it. In most parts of the world, conservatives and people on the left of centre and in the centre all agree on the science, because the science is not now in dispute. And it's a shame that in the United States there are people who seem to question the science in a way that is just irrational. But in most parts of the world, that's not the case. People do accept that climate change is occurring, that humanity is causing it, and the disagreements are about how to act on it, which is why the change in the nature of the economic arguments, this growth of grassroots activism and the displays of anxiety and concern about this, I think could change the politics. In the US, President Obama is taking a very brave route. He's trying to act on climate change through regulating power plants and regulating vehicle standards, and doing it outside Congress, doing it with his own executive authority. And he certainly does want to act on climate change, and we must hope that, that the next president, because President Obama will not be with us for much longer, will also want to do the same. What I think Americans can be reassured by is that countries outside the US, particularly China, particularly many developing countries, are now recognizing this as a problem and are now beginning to act on it. And so what we need to happen at the summit this week, in Paris next year, is this groundswell of concern leading to commitments being made, because only if all countries do this together will we really address this problem. So yes, it's a problem in the United States in particular, but there is a commitment there is commitment elsewhere. What we need to do is to strengthen these leaders so that they don't go back on these commitments that they're likely to make tomorrow at the summit in New York.
Lassman-Trappier, are you feeling more hopeful now that there may be the possibility of real change than you were, say, 5 years ago?
I try and be optimistic, and I always hope that we will come over all the environmental problems. I hope that we manage to rise to the challenge. I think it's brave. We have to be brave to rise to this challenge, but actually it would be quite cowardly not to do anything about climate change, because, you know, we're facing a fairly difficult end if we don't address the problem soon.
Well, Michael Jacobs, it would appear to be that the key issue is that everybody accepts it, that this is in their own self-interest. Would you agree?
I think that's absolutely the case. Sometimes climate activists have been their own worst enemy. They've talked about we need to do something about climate change for future generations, as if this was a long way away. But it isn't a long way away. You can see the impact of climate change now in many countries. In the US, Hurricane Sandy, this extraordinary drought that's going on in California. In many parts of the world, flooding and drought simultaneously taking place in different parts of the world that look to be part of climate change. And then if you look at the further projections of the worst climate change that will occur if we don't get a grip of greenhouse gas emissions, that's not in some future generations. I've got a son who's 18. That's when he's my age. That's when all these predictions look particularly severe. So this isn't about doing something